Welcome to episode 3 of this read-along book club of Ted Chiang's The Stories of Your Life and Others. Today we're going to talk about two stories that are very strange, the first one of which didn't feel like it was something that Ted Chiang has ever written. Definitely there are some scientific implications, one might say. Alchemical would be a little bit more accurate. It's starting to weave Hebrew mythology, I guess, into this whole thing. And the second one doesn't feel like a story to me whatsoever. It makes a lot more sense when you read the story notes, both of which I'm going to cover in this read-along, but let me know what you're thinking so far. Are you still liking it? Is this a bit of a letdown after Story of Your Life? To me it is. Definitely to me it is. But let us get into the text itself and start with 72 letters. When he was a child, Robert's favorite toy was a simple one, a clay doll that could do nothing but walk forward. Robert would follow the doll as it marched down the corridors of the family home. And sometimes when this doll would bump up into the wall, it would gradually mash its arms and legs into misshapen flippers. And Robert would let it do that strictly for his own amusement. The little bastard. It wasn't the sculpting that Robert enjoyed, though. It was mapping out the limits of the name. And another of his dolls walked on 4 legs. And he formed the legs separately and then attached them to the body. But he wasn't able to erase the seams fully. The name didn't recognize the body as a single continuous piece. By this point in time, I had no idea where the story was going. I didn't know what the hell a name was, but thankfully on the very next page, we kind of get it more or less. But the names looked entirely different. On each scrap of parchment were inscribed 72 tiny Hebrew letters, arranged in 12 rows of 6. And so far, as you could tell, the order of the letters was utterly random. So being the nerd I am, being the tabletop role-playing game nerd I am ever since I was a kid, I was very familiar with golems, homunaculi, which are in this as well. However, I didn't really know the history behind them. It's got quite an interesting history, an alchemical history. I'll probably post a little thing up here, something that I found on Wikipedia that was a very strange description, something that was found in a text in the 1500s. Robert Stratton and his fourth form classmates sat quietly as Master Trevelyan paced between the rows of desks. Langdale, what is the doctrine of names? All things are reflections of God, and all... Spare us your bumbling. Thorburn, can you tell us the doctrine of names? As all things are reflections of God, so are names and reflections of divine name. And what is an object's true name? The name that reflects the divine name in the same manner as the object reflects God. And what is the action of a true name? To endow its object with a reflection of divine power. Correct. Hallowell, what is the doctrine of signatures? And on and on and on. So we know that he is learning the groundwork of what all this is, as we are too. But after stopping at the dormitory, Robert met his friend Lionel at the border of school grounds. So the wait's over. Today's the day? Robert asked. During his first year at Cheltenham, Robert had known Lionel hardly at all. He was one of the day boys, and Robert, like all boarders, regarded them with suspicion. Conversation revealed their shared interest in the sciences, and the two became fast friends. I couldn't wait to get out of there, he said. Why do they even bother calling it natural philosophy? A boy's guide to nomenclature, which informed them that the nomenclators no longer spoke in terms of God or the divine name, nor was there a single true name for a given object. Depending on its precise shape, a body might be compatible with several names known as euonyms, and conversely, a simple name might tolerate significant variations in body shape, as his childhood marching doll had demonstrated. All right. Chiang's kind of losing me here, but let's keep going on. Lionel had converted a tool shed in his family's garden into a laboratory, and he was working on an experiment that he was keeping secret. Lionel's latest experiment, it was a cucurbit clamped in a stand so that its bottom rested in a basin full of water, which in turn sat on a tripod above a lit oil lamp. A mercury thermometer was also fixed in the basin. Take a look, said Lionel. The froth consisted of homunaculi, tiny seminal fetuses. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, you heard that right. Tiny seminal fetuses. So you wanked off in a jar and kept the spunk warm? Indeed, that is exactly what Lionel did. You have to keep the temperature just right, of course, but if you want them to grow, you also have to keep the right mix of nutrients. Too thin a mix and they starve. Too rich and they get over lively and start fighting with each other. You're having me on. Battles among sperm are what cause monstrosities to be born. If an injured fetus is the one that makes it to the egg, the baby that's born is deformed. How long can you keep them growing? Probably not much longer. I read about one in France that was grown till it was the size of a fist. Okay, this is bonkers. So apparently, according to the story notes, this was scientific belief at one point, is that a single sperm, if kept alive, if given the proper nutrients, as Lionel is talking about, can grow and grow and grow, because I believe, and I'll probably correct myself once we get there, that they thought that a fully formed person was in a sperm and they just had to grow. I think that's what this is about. Master Trevelyan had drilled into them. All living things had been created at the same time, long ago, and births today were merely enlargements of the previously imperceptible. Okay, I don't know why I got that word wrong so many times. But Robert Stratton went on to read nomenclature at Cambridge's Trinity College. He studied Kabbalistic texts that laid the foundation for science of names. So we get to meet a Kabbalist, I think it's Kabbalist, later in the story. But he learned that every name was a combination of several epithets, each designating a specific trait or capability. He studied the modern techniques of nominal integration and factorization. There had long been two classes of names, those for animating a body and those functioning as amulets. And this is where we learn that health amulets were worn as protection from injury or illness, while others rendered a house resistant to fire or a ship less likely to founder at sea. So kind of cool technology for this weird steampunk world. Science of thermodynamics, which established the inconvertibility of heat and work, had recently explained how automata gain their motive power by absorbing heat from their surroundings. The Namenmeister, or a Namenmeister, that's a funny name, in Berlin had developed a new class of amulet that caused the body to absorb heat from one location and release it in another. But upon graduation, Stratton took up residence in London and secured a position as a nomenclator at Code Manufactory. Stratton's most recent automaton, cast from plaster of Paris, followed a few paces behind him as he entered the factory building. So we are fast forwarding to his career where he has these basically golems, these automatons, marching these robotic things, and we learn that Stratton is going to be famous for replacing the hands, making them articulated as opposed to little paddles, which is when he gets the offer. But they walked past a row of low vats in which the clay was mixed. The paddles stirring in the clay were connected by gears to a drive shaft. At the end of the room stood an autonomous engine, a cast iron giant that cranked the drive wheel tirelessly. And the next room held the molds for casting. And a sculptor notices him. Were you looking for someone, sir? I am to meet Master Willoughby here, replied Stratton. Harold Willoughby was a master sculptor first degree. Stratton was consulting him on the design of a reusable mold for casting his automaton. Willoughby entered from the door to the metalworks. My apologies for being late, Mr. Stratton. Is this what you've had more doing all these months? Gesturing to this new automaton. But Stratton nodded. Some nice detail, looks straightforward enough. Hold on now. And he pointed to the automaton's hands, the articulated hands, right? Rather than the traditional paddle or mitten design, with fingers suggested by grooves on the surface, these were fully formed. You don't mean to tell me those are functional? That's correct. Show me. Stratton addressed the automaton. Flex your fingers. Well, I congratulate you, Mr. Stratton. Or can you design a piece mold for such a form? That will be a tricky bit of business. I think they will be worth the expense. Permit me to demonstrate. And the automaton trudged over to a nearby wall and picked up the pieces of the mold. That's enough. And the automaton stopped its work and resumed its original standing posture. So Willoughby is a little bit taken aback here. Do you have names that can learn other tasks? Not as yet. However, there's every reason to believe that an entire class of similar name exists. One for every sort of skill needing manual dexterity. Indeed. Let us go to your office and speak about this further. And Stratton had the automaton follow the two of them back to the frontmost of the complex. Do you have an objection to my automaton? You've done an admirable job of emulating the human hand. I am concerned, however, that the first skill in which you trained your new automaton is sculpture. Why did you choose sculpture? My ultimate goal is to allow automatous engines to be manufactured inexpensively, enough so that most of the families could purchase one. How, pray tell, would a family make use of an engine? To drive a powered loom, for example. Have you ever seen children who are employed in a textile mill? They are worked to exhaustion. This is when we see the spark of Stratton caring about the lower class. An automaton like mine could cast engines very cheaply. People could earn a decent income without being subjected to the conditions of the factory. Powered looms are considerably more expensive than hand looms of old, My automata could also assist in production of cast iron parts. But what would happen to the sculptors? Your intentions notwithstanding, these automata of yours would put sculptors out of work. The learning capabilities of these automata are extremely limited. They can manipulate molds, but they could never design them. They will perform only rote tasks. I believe these automata can help restore dignity to the professions, and without great cost to yours. Not only is the suggestion insulting, it seems ripe for calamity. These automata are so far removed from being in a position to reproduce themselves without human participation that I scarcely know where to begin listing the objections. Your reaction is completely unwarranted. I think it's entirely appropriate. In that case, I will work with sculptors at another manufactory. I think our discussion is at an end. Good day to you, Mr. Stratton. It was the following day, and Stratton was taking his midday stroll through a district of Lambeth where Code Manufactory was located. I see your health amulet failed you, sir. Your remedy lies in the curative powers of magnetism, concentrated in Dr. Sedgwick's polarizing tablets. Nonsense, retorted an old woman. What you need is tincture of mandrake, tried and true. Seeing no other new dolls, though, Stratton left the market and walked on. Without the cooperation of the sculptors' trade union, he'd have to resort to hiring independent sculptors. Mr. Stratton? A small, wiry man, plainly dressed. My name is Davies. I'm in the employ of Lord Fieldhurst. Edward Maitland, 3rd Earl of Fieldhurst and noted zoologist and comparative anatomist, was president of the Royal Society. This is the man who wants to give him a job. Lord Fieldhurst would like to speak with you at your earliest convenience regarding your recent work. Why did you not call me at the office? Lord Fieldhurst prefers privacy in this matter. Please inform Lord Fieldhurst that I would be delighted. At the promised hour, Davies arrived with the carriage and took him all the way there. Seated at the desk within the study was a barrel-chested man wearing a silk coat and cravat. Lord Fieldhurst, it's an honor. A pleasure to meet you, Mr. Stratton. You've been doing some excellent work recently. Please, tell me what motivated you to develop such automata. Stratton explained all of his plan. I'm pleased to find that you have such philanthropic motives because I would ask your assistance in a project I'm directing. But before I speak further, I must first have your word that you will retain everything I reveal to you in the utmost confidence. And of course he agrees. He takes him to a laboratory, and there's an elderly man peering into the microscope at the furthest station. He looks up from his work as they enter. Mr. Stratton, I believe you know Dr. Ashbourne? Nicholas Ashbourne had been a lecturer at Trinity when Stratton was studying there, but he had left many years ago to pursue studies of, it was said, an unorthodox nature. Stratton, good to see you again. This will be an evening full of surprises, my boy. Prepare yourself. Only a small number of individuals, either fellows of the Royal Society or members of Parliament, or both, are privy to this matter. The long cellar contained row upon row of stout wooden tables, each one supporting a tank roughly the size of a bathtub. There was a distortion floating in the center of the tank, as if some of the liquid had congealed into a mass of jelly. It was then that the coagulum resolved itself into the ghostly figure of a man, clear as aspic, curled up in a fetal position. So here we are. Here is the homunculus. Incredible, Stratton whispered. We call it a megafetus, and this had me laugh out loud when I read it, the megafetus. But I guess it is indeed a megafetus if it appears to be a man. Several years ago, 2 Parisian naturalists named Debussy and Gill developed a method of inducing hypertrophic growth in a seminal fetus. The rapid infusion of nutrients allows such a fetus to reach the size within a fortnight. Is the creature alive? Only an insensate matter. All we've done is effect a maturation in size and scale. All megafetuses have no features beyond the sex. Every male bears the generic appearance you see here, but all the females are likewise identical. So what was the intention of the experiment if not to develop an artificial womb? To test the notion of the fixity of a species. A biologist could examine the future generations nested in the spermatozoa of any species and see whether their appearance remains fixed or changes to give rise to a new species. Once a fetus reaches its adult size, one can extract a spermatozoon from it and enlarge a fetus from the next generation in the same manner. Repetition of the process let us examine the unborn generations of any given species. So this is weird. They're thinking that they can, just kind of go back through time and or actually into the future, I guess, to see all of these unborn creatures that are the offspring of the species, current species. They tested many animal species, but never observed any changes in form. However, they obtained a peculiar result when working with the seminal fetuses of humans, but the line terminated in a sterile generation. Therein lies the problem. Therein lies the problem. And this story gets kind of weird. It gets into eugenics at some point, but we will get there. The human species has the potential to exist for only a fixed number of generations, and we are within 5 generations of the final one. So there it is. There is the problem. And Stratton turned to Ashbourne, half expecting him to confess that it was all an elaborate hoax. But the elder nomenclator looked entirely solemn. From what I know, the extinction of a species has never been observed. We do have the evidence of the fossil record, which suggests that a species remain unchanged for a period of time, and then are abruptly replaced by new forms. And what of the origination of new species? If they're not born from existing species, do they arise spontaneously? That is yet uncertain. So they're trying to figure out the secret of evolution, I guess. Have you found another species that evinces a final generation? Not as yet. Perhaps it is the process whose limits have been discovered, not the species. An astute observation, Mr. Stratton. We must ready a course of action immediately. You realize why not all the sperm samples from donors of the same age produce the same number of generations? Some lineages are approaching their end faster than others. Panic may arise well before the end is reached. Precisely, and writing could extinguish our species as effectively as the exhaustion of generations. That is why time is of the essence. What is the solution you propose? Then Ashbourne rose. Do you recall why it was that all attempts to make automata out of wood were abandoned? It was believed that the natural grain of wood implies a form in conflict with whatever we try to carve upon it. But if the native form of wood were the only obstacle, shouldn't it be possible to animate an animal's corpse with a name? Has it never been attempted? In fact, it has. Also unsuccessfully. Does that mean there is no way to animate organic matter using names? This was the question I left Trinity in order to pursue. And what did you discover? The lexical order of an animating name increases the order of a body, thus providing motive, power for an automaton. A steer can be reduced to a vat of gelatinous broth. The broth comprises the same material as the steer, but which embodies a higher amount of order? The steer, obviously. An organism, by virtue of its physical structure, embodies order. The more complex the organism, the greater the amount of order. The question is, what is life but not form? The answer is an unfertilized ovum. The next step was to artificially induce the growth of an embryo from an ovum by application of a name. You mean structure would arise out of a homogeneous medium? Impossible. My first experiments consisted of applying a name to unfertilized frog eggs. Then he withdrew one from the largest pair and handed it to Stratton to examine. The glass needle, this glass needle he's speaking about that I did not mention, was not clear but instead seemed to contain some sort of dappled core. While that may appear to be some sort of medical implement, it is in fact a vehicle for a name. The only relevant information is that I incorporated the sexual epithet. It was one of the few epithets that was dimorphic, having male and female variants. Do you mean to tell me that touching the frog's egg with this needle is all that's needed? Removing the name doesn't end its influence? Precisely. By incorporating different epithets, I was able to induce the egg to adopt different forms, some of which had every appearance of embryonic frogs. Eventually, I found a name that caused the egg not only to assume the form of a tadpole, but also to mature and hatch. The tadpole thus hatched grew into a frog indistinguishable from any other member of the species. Ooh, they're onto something. They're going to reproduce without people. This is going to get weird, guys. As this method of reproduction does not involve sexual congress, I have termed it parthenogenesis. The logical conclusion of this research is to discover a euonym for the human species. You wish for mankind to perpetuate itself through nomenclature. You find the prospect troubling, said Fieldhurst. That is to be expected. No one relishes the prospect of humans being conceived artificially, but can you offer an alternative? Precisely how do you envision this name being used? When a husband is unable to impregnate his wife, they will seek the services of a physician. The physician will collect the woman's menses, separate the ovum, impress the name upon it, and then reintroduce it into a womb. A child born of this method would have no biological father. True, but the father's biological contribution is of minimal importance here. Are you confident this will result in well-formed children? They all knew of the disastrous attempt in the previous century to create improved children by mesmerizing women during their pregnancies. Oh, the crazy things we did. If the lexical order of the impressed name does not closely match the structural order of the species, the resulting fetuses does not quicken. This does not remove the need for the mother to maintain a tranquil mind during her pregnancy, but the ovum selectivity provides us assurance that any fetus induced will be well formed in every aspect except the one anticipated. What aspect is that? Can you not guess? The female frogs created were fertile. Their eggs could be fertilized in either the conventional manner or by repeating the impression with the name. Presumably, there needs to be further differences between the male and female variants than simply sexual epithet. While a fertile male and fertile female might seem equivalent, they differ radically in the degree of complexity exemplified. Have you developed eunym's for other species? Just over a score of various types. Our progress has been rapid. How many nomenclatures are engaged in this endeavor? Only a handful. But why are you approaching me? The genus of names you have developed is unique. Yours can control human hands, which are uniquely versatile instruments. The very reason your names are worrisome to sculptors is the reason we are interested in them. They endow automata with a more human-like manner than any before. So now we ask, will you join us? You honor me with your invitation, but what of my work with dexterous automata? Indeed, the first thing we wish you to do is perfect the epithet for dexterity, but your efforts at social reform would be for naught unless we first ensure the survival of all species. I trust you will divide your time between the two projects wisely. Your work on biological nomenclature must remain confidential, obviously. Is that satisfactory? It is. Very well then, gentlemen. I accept. And they shake hands. They shake on the deal. Some weeks had passed and Stratton had last spoke with Willoughby, beyond a chilly exchange of greetings in passing. In fact, he had little interaction with any of the union sculptors. He entered the manufactory through the front gallery, and today it was crowded with domestic automata. "Good morning, Pierce," he said. "What are all these doing here?" "Everyone's eager to get the latest." "You're going to be busy this afternoon." "I'm certain I can finish in time." Stratton finds himself confronted by Willoughby. "Good morning, Master Willoughby. I've been informed that Code will be allowing non-union sculptors onto the premises to assist you." "Yes, but I assure you, only the most reputable independent sculptors are involved." "As if such persons exist. You should know that I recommend that our trade union launch a strike against Code in protest." It had been decades since the last strike launched by the sculptors, and that one had ended in rioting. "And other sculptors with whom I've discussed your work agree with me about the threat it poses. Apparently the Royal Societies intervened on your behalf and persuaded the Brotherhood to refrain for the time being. The Royal Society considers my research worthwhile. Once you have seen how sculptors can use these automata, you will realize there is no threat to your profession." The next time he saw Lord Fieldhurst, Stratton asked him about the Royal Society's involvement. "Ah, yes. While the Brotherhood of Sculptors as a whole is quite formidable, it is composed of individuals who individually are more amenable to persuasion. They've agreed to postpone any decision about strikes until after you've given a demonstration of your system of manufacturing." "I had no idea that the Royal Society employed such tactics." "The advancement of science is not always a straightforward affair, Mr. Stratton. Indeed, it is not." And Stratton was given accommodations in the guest wing of Darrington Hall, as were the other nomenclators working under Lord Fieldhurst's direction. Ashbourne had developed an entirely different system of integration and factorization. For Stratton, it was almost like returning to university and learning nomenclature all over again. So he is definitely in some uncharted territory here. Stratton also learned more about the sexual epithet traditionally used to confer either male or female qualities to an automaton. In fact, its earliest use was claimed to have occurred in biblical times. Here we go with more Hebrew mythology. When Joseph's brother created a female golem, there it is, golem, they could share sexually without violating the prohibition against such behavior with a woman. Guys will always find a way. Guys will always find a way, even in biblical times. And gradually, Stratton absorbed sufficient information to begin participating in the tests of prospective human names. The nomenclators paid women, typically young housemaids in good health, for their menses as a source of human ova. But once a name was found that could generate human fetuses, women could reproduce purely by themselves. Oh man, they don't need us anymore. We're screwed. Would such a society, exactly, here we go, he's asking the question, flourish by magnifying the finer sensibilities of the gentle sex, or would it collapse under the unrestrained pathology of its membership? I think you need balance. I think nature knows what it's doing. I think billions of years of evolution knows what it's doing, more or less. By incorporating his epithets for dexterity, Stratton was able to separate the digits and refine the overall appearance of the forms. He's getting closer. But Ashbourne leaned forward. Suppose we were able to factor out an epithet common of the names developed by you and Milburn. You're suggesting that if an epithet is capable of inducing 2 levels of thermodynamic order in the inorganic domain, it might create 2 generations in the organic domain. Such a name might create males whose spermatozoa, these words, will contain preformed fetuses. Those males will be fertile, although any sons they produce would again be sterile. Precisely. Order that begets order. It would have the number of medical interventions required for a race to sustain itself. What would constitute a still higher level of order in the inorganic domain? Automata working cooperatively, perhaps. We do not yet know, but perhaps in time we will. Dr. Ashbourne, when I was initiated into our group, Lord Fieldhurst spoke of the possibility that species are born in the wake of catastrophic events. No naturalist has suggested a mechanism by which this could occur. On the other hand, while we do know that a lexical process can create order, the creation of an entire new species would require a name of incalculable power. And seated at his desk at the manufactory, Stratton squinted to read the pamphlet he'd been given on the street. Shall men be the masters of names, or shall names be the masters of men? That is the question. For too long, the capitalists have hoarded names within their coffers, guarded by patent and lock and key, amassing fortunes by mere possession of letters. While the common man must labor for every shilling, they will ring the alphabet until they have extracted every last penny from it, and only then discard it for us to use. How long will we allow this to continue? And Stratton continues to scan the pamphlet, but found nothing new in it. For the past 2 months, he'd been reading them and encountered only the usual anarchist rants. His public demonstration of the dexterous automata was scheduled for the next week. There was a knock at his office door, and a man entered. Please allow me to introduce myself. My name is Benjamin Roth. I am a Kabbalist. How may I be of assistance? I've heard that you have achieved a great advance in the permutation of letters. The goal of Kabbalists is to better know God. The best means by which to do that is to study the art by which he creates. Your epithets for dexterity enable a golem to sculpt another, thereby reproducing itself. A name capable of creating a being that is, in turn, capable of creation would bring us closer to God than we have ever been before. The ability to manipulate molds does not render an automaton able to reproduce itself. I myself, in the course of my studies, have developed an epithet designating certain other skills necessary. How is it that your automata possess the dexterity required for scrivening, but not that of manipulating molds? It simply enables a golem to write out the name that animates it and nothing else. I imagine it doesn't have a broad application, does it? To us, the value of this epithet, like any other, lies not in the usefulness it imparts a golem, but in the ecstatic state it allows us to achieve. And your interest in my epithets for dexterity is the same? I am hoping that you will share your epithets with us. I'm afraid I cannot grant you any of my names. You desire payment of royalties? I have specific intentions for my dexterous automata which require that I retain control over my patent. I cannot jeopardize those plans by releasing the names indiscriminately. The most I can do is remind you that the patent has a limited duration. Once it is expired, you are free to use the name however you like. Thank you for speaking with me. And with that, Roth took his leave, very disappointed. Peering through the eyepiece of the microscope, Stratton turned the manipulator's adjustment wheel until the needle pressed against the side of the ovum. There was a sudden unfolding, transforming the sphere into a tiny fetus. And Stratton and his colleagues had been diligently compiling descriptions of human uniqueness, trying to distill a set of epithets both expressive enough to denote these qualities and succinct enough to be integrated with the physical epithets into a 72-letter name. Here we go, full circle, guys. He decided to pass the rest of the evening in the drawing room upstairs. And there he found Fieldhurst and Ashbourne seated in his leather chair. Just up from the laboratory, Stratton? Inquired Fieldhurst. I feel that my latest permutations are leading in the right direction. It now appears that we will have a euonym comfortably in advance of the final generation. Once we have human reproduction under our control, we will have a means of preventing the poor from having such large families as so many of them persist in having right now. So here we go. Here's the eugenics thing. And this is kind of where I think I checked out a little bit before this because I felt like I've read stories and watched movies that have explored these ideas. I should have looked to see how old the story was, but I did not. So maybe this, was prior to all of those things. I don't know, but it goes down very familiar paths at this point, and unfortunately doesn't really result in anything interesting. I think that's what I always do is I cling to hope, right? That a short story will have some kind of reveal that will make everything else worthwhile if it doesn't feel great up until that point. And often short stories do rely on a kind of a twist, or a reveal of some kind at the end. Chang's don't really seem to for the most part, though. Just little ones. I don't think that they necessarily, the entire story hinges on them, though. By exercising some judgment when choosing who are made their children or not, our government could preserve the nation's racial stock. While commoners are not without virtues, they are lacking in refinement and intellect. Here we go. We've heard this all before, guys. So name impressing will be withheld from the lower classes? Not entirely. When the truth about declining fertility is known, it would be an invitation to riot if the lower classes were denied access to name impressing. I envision that the policy will go into effect only after some years have passed, by which time people will have grown accustomed to name impression as the method of fertilization. Our goal was the survival of the species, not the implementation of partisan politics. It is also our duty to guarantee its health by keeping proper balance in its population. I wonder if improvement in conditions for the poor might eventually cause them to gestate more refined children? Do not expect that a mere increase in economic comfort will improve the mentality of the lower classes. But why not? A woman who has lived her life among Prussians naturally gives birth to a child with Prussian traits. In this manner, the national character of that populace has sustained itself for centuries, despite many changes in fortune. For the remainder of the evening, the conversation turned to other topics. Finally, after Fieldhurst had retired for the evening, Stratton and Ashbourne descended to the laboratory to confer. What manner of man have we agreed to help? One who would breed people like livestock? Our group's goal has always been to duplicate for humans a procedure that was intended only for animals. I cannot be a party to this. What would be accomplished by your resigning from this group? Stratton tried to regain his composure. So what course of action should we take? I should have anticipated this. My error was in viewing humanity purely as a single species. Having seen England and France working toward a common goal, I forgot that nations are not the only factions that oppose one another. What if we surreptitiously distributed the names to the laboring classes? They could draw their own needles and impress the name themselves in secret. I'm dubious that the operation could be carried out on such a scale necessary without attracting governmental attention. Do you recall our speculation about a name that would induce 2 generations of fetuses? Certainly. Suppose we develop such a name but do not reveal this property when we present it to Lord Fieldhurst. All the children born of such a name would be fertile, so they would be able to reproduce without governmental restriction. But what if the following generation, sterility would recur? Perhaps the only permanent solution would be a more liberal parliament, but it is beyond my expertise to suggest how we might bring that about. What if we could induce multiple generations with the initial name impression, a longer period before sterility recurs? The technical difficulty of inducing multiple generations is such that I'd sooner wager on a successful sprouting wings and taking flight. And the 2 men discussed strategies late into the night. We must employ even more caution when approaching prospective members than Lord Fieldhurst did when establishing this group originally. Agreed. Here we are forming a secret organization nested within a secret organization. If only fetuses were so easily induced. It was the evening of the following day. The sun was setting and Stratton was strolling across Westminster Bridge. He thought back to the conversation where he and Ashbourne had first entertained the conjecture of factoring out an epithet for creating 2 levels of order. And Ashbourne had suggested that the next level of order might be automata working together in a coordinated fashion. Was that possible? He suddenly realized he had reached Code Manufactory. As he reached the hallway fronting the nomenclator's offices, he saw light emanating from the frosted glass window of his office door. A man lay face down on the floor in front of the desk, hands tied behind his back. It was Benjamin Roth, and he was dead. He'd been tortured before he was killed, and Stratton stepped forward to see what had been done there. His dexterous automaton had been destroyed, unfortunately. He heard a sound behind him, and a broad-shouldered man stepped out. "Good of you to come," the man said. Stratton bolted out of the back door and out of the studio. He fled through the darkened building, crossing workrooms filled with coke and iron bars, crucibles and molds, and all illuminated by the moonlight entering through skylights overhead. He had entered the metalworks portion of the factory. Stratton looked around for a promising hiding place. He looked more closely and recognized it as a military engine, seeing all these crazy automaton there. These automata were built for the War Office gun carriages that aimed their own cannon and rapid-fire rifles. But there was no ammunition here. He stole into the next room. It was the packing room, filled with pine crates and loose straw. His only exit was through the factory's front door, but he risked encountering the assassin if he headed back the way he'd come. From the front of the packing room came the sound of footsteps. Stratton ducked behind a row of crates. Stratton turned around and immediately realized his mistake. The door to the ceramic works was in the opposite wall. He had cornered himself. Was there anything in the room he could use as a weapon? And Stratton could hear the assassin opening side doors and searching other storerooms. Then he noticed the automaton standing off to the side, a porter used for moving the inventory about. Stratton checked the back of the porter's head. A tab of parchment protruded from the horizontal slot in the iron. In the darkness, he quickly wrote 72 letters in the familiar combination, and folded the paper and put it into that square. To the porter, he whispered, "Go stand as close to the door as you can." And then the pursuer had arrived. "Get out of the way," barked the man. Ever obedient, the automaton shifted to take a step back when Stratton yanked out its name. But Stratton was able to insert the new name, cramming the square of paper into the slot as deeply as he could. And the porter resumed walking forward, this time with a fast, stiff gait, his childhood doll, now life-size. So a little bit of full circle action there. It immediately ran into the door and, unperturbed, because remember, his automaton were running into the door and mashing their hands up, kept it shut with the force of its marching. "Stop!" the assassin ordered. "Stop walking, you! Stop!" The automaton continued marching, oblivious to all commands. The man stretched his arm through and reached around the back of the automaton's head, and he plucked it. "Fancy yourself clever, don't you?" he called out. Then he disappeared. Stratton relaxed slightly. Had the man given up? Suddenly, the man's arm came through the window again, this time carrying a jar of fluid. He poured it over the automaton's head, and the man's arm reappeared, bearing a match, and touched it to the automaton. The room was flooded with light as the automaton's head and upper back burst into flames. The flames gradually died out. He realized the man was pushing at the door again. Stratton tried to run past him, but the assassin easily grabbed him and knocked him down with a clout to the head. The man tore the health amulet from Stratton's wrist and then tied his hands together behind his back. "He's going to hog time and kill him, everybody." "What kind of man are you to do things like this?" the assassin chuckled. "Men are no different from your automata. Slip a bloke a piece of paper and the proper figures on it, and he'll do your bidding. Do you keep copies of your work at home?" "At my desk in the study." "No other copies hidden anywhere?" "No." "Your friend upstairs didn't have copies, but perhaps someone else does." "No one." "Didn't post any letters? Corresponding with the colleagues, that sort of thing?" "Nothing that anyone could use to reconstruct my work." "You're lying to me." Then Stratton heard a sharp thud, and the pressure in his back eased. Standing next to him was Davies, holding a leather blackjack. Davies saves the day. "Davies, how did you—" "Lord Fieldhurst sent me the moment he learned whom Willoughby had contacted." Davies helped Stratton up to his feet and handed him his notebook. "Who's the fellow there?" "His name was Benjamin Roth. And as you wouldn't give me your work, he likely felt justified in taking it himself. It's an outrageous injustice that he was the one to die. He had nothing to do with this affair." Davies bandaged Stratton's fingers to a splint, assuring him that the Royal Society would discreetly handle any consequences of the night's events. They gathered the oil-stained papers from Stratton's office. By the time they were finished, a carriage had arrived to take Stratton back to Darrington Hall. He felt much more composed the next morning and ready to begin sorting through his trunk full of papers. Stratton found a notebook he didn't recognize. Its pages contained Hebrew letters arranged in the familiar patterns of nominal integration and factorization, but all the notes in the Hebrew as well. He realized it must have belonged to Roth. He'd never seen a Kabbalist notebook before. Much of the terminology was archaic, but he could understand it well enough. Roth's achievement was more elegant than he'd previously thought. The notes indicated that such a name would express its lexical nature through whatever means the body allowed. The animated body wouldn't even need hands to write out the name. If the epithet were incorporated properly, a porcelain horse could likely accomplish the task by dragging a hoof in the dirt. Combined with one of Stratton's epithets for dexterity, Roth's epithet would indeed let an automaton do most of what was needed to reproduce. And abruptly, Stratton realized that he didn't need a name that redoubled physical complexity, but one that enabled lexical duplication. The solution was to impress the ovum with an autonym and thus induce a fetus that bore its own name. The women conceived this way would be fertile as always. The men conceived this way would also be fertile. He and Dr. Ashbourne had assumed that creating animals capable of reproducing meant giving them preformed fetuses because that was the method employed by nature. Stratton envisioned a day when the human species could survive as long as its own behavior allowed, when it could stand or fall based purely on its own actions and not simply vanish once some predetermined lifespan had elapsed. Nor would any group of people control the fecundity of another. In the procreative domain, at least, liberty would be restored to the individual. By the time the autonyms, true power became apparent, an entire generation consisting of millions of people worldwide would have been born of the name, and there would be no way any government could control their reproduction. He hastened to his desk where he opened his own notebook and Ross side by side. Already in his mind, Stratton was transposing the letters, searching for the permutation that denoted both the human body and itself, and an ontogenic encoding for the species. Well, that's the end of it. Sorry I really didn't have much commentary. It just didn't stick with me. It wasn't super interesting in terms of like the what if statement that I love so much about speculative fiction and science fiction in this situation. But it is what it is. Let me know what you think. I don't know that anybody really cared for this story that I've spoken to who are reading along with us here. But I suppose it is worth going back to the story notes briefly to see what old Ted Chiang has to say about this story. In what's probably the best known story of the golem, Rabbi Lau of Prague brings a clay statue to life to act as a defender of the Jews, protecting them from persecution. So there's a little bit more depth there than just human reproduction. But in stories dating back to the 2nd century, rabbis would animate golems not to accomplish anything practical, but rather to demonstrate mastery of the art of permutating letters. They sought to know God better by performing acts of creation. So somewhat related to Tower of Babylon, how they were trying to reach heaven, the vault of heaven, to see God, to know God. But what I found particularly interesting about golems was the fact that they're traditionally unable to speak. Since the golem is created through language, this limitation is also a limitation on reproduction. If a golem were able to use language, it would be capable of self-replication. The other idea I'd been thinking about was preformation, the theory that organisms exist fully formed in the germ cells of their parents, which he says it's easy to laugh at now, but that's how it used to be at one point, which is kind of funny to think about. All right, let's briefly talk about the evolution of human science. This one didn't feel like a story for me, but once we go to the story notes, it'll make a little bit more sense. However, I don't understand why maybe Ted Chiang writes so few stories that his collections are just what he's ever written. I don't know. But it has been 25 years since a report of original research was last submitted to our editors for publication, making this an appropriate time to revisit the question that was so widely debated then. What is the role of human scientists in an age when the frontiers of scientific inquiry have moved beyond the comprehension of humans? Metahumans began to dominate experimental research. So humans are a, V1, metahumans are a V2. They made their findings available only via DNT, which is the digital neural transfer, leaving journals to publish secondhand accounts translated into human language so we could understand it. But one of its costs to human researchers was that the realization that they would likely never make an original contribution to science again. So it's kind of the somewhat extinction of our species, which I think is somewhat relevant when you're thinking about AI and how it's just exploding right now, and what are we going to bring to the table when AI can create so many things quickly. I'd say creativity is probably going to be our last bastion, because things like, programming and logic and all that, I mean, they're inherently fitted for computers to think, right? It's just finding the best possible route. However, until they learn creativity, even in coding, right? Because I think there are some avenues that human programmers may not take in terms of a brute force approach that machines can't yet do. So I don't know. We'll see how it goes. So far, it's not looking so great. But the availability of devices based on metahuman science gave rise to an artifact, hermeneutics. Scientists began attempting to reverse engineer these artifacts and to understand physical principles underlying their operation. But a recent target of investigation is the EXA collider recently installed beneath the Gobi Desert. But the question is, are these worthwhile undertakings for scientists? It is important to recognize that, unlike most previous low-technology cultures confronted with a high-technology one, humans are in no danger of assimilation or extinction. Really? This lack of an assimilation mechanism means that human parents of a metahuman child face a difficult choice: to allow their child D&T interaction with metahuman culture and watch their child grow incomprehensible to them, or else restrict access to D&T during the child's formative years. So again, yeah, do we let our children leave us behind? Different intelligence enhancing therapy, one that would allow individuals to gradually upgrade their minds to a metahuman equivalent level. Such a therapy would offer a bridge across what has become the greatest cultural divide in our species' history. We need not be intimidated by the accomplishments of metahuman science. We should always remember that the technologies that made metahumans possible were originally invented by humans, and they were no smarter than we. Well, that is wishful thinking, Ted Chiang, because there's a lot of people talking about AI, and this kind of feels like in the same pathway anyway, and it's not looking so great, but we'll see what happens. We'll briefly look at the story notes for this section because it illuminates what the hell you just read, because when I read that, I'm like, what the hell was this? This wasn't a story. This felt like an outline for a story. So here it is. This short was written for the British science journal Nature. Makes more sense now. Throughout the year 2000, Nature ran a feature called Futures. Each week, a different writer provided a short fictional treatment of a scientific development occurring in the next millennium. Since the piece would appear in a scientific journal, making it about a scientific journal seemed like a natural choice. And there we are. That is why that story was written that way. I think in the context of Nature magazine with all of this other stuff, it was probably pretty cool. But in a book full of short stories that are traditional narratives, more or less, it's kind of a sour one for me. Both of these weren't that great. I'm not going to lie. The 72 letters was man, it felt like such a long read. Some of these do. I feel like a lot of these stories are just a little bit too long. It's almost like short stories to me need to be digestible in a very short amount of time. I think 72 letters took me at least an hour and a half to get through. On my Kindle it said anyway. That's too long for a short story. That's kind of veering into novella territory. I don't know. Let me know how you feel about it in the comments, but that's one of the things that's a little bit frustrating is Ted Chiang's stories they're like too long for me. They're too long to be a short story. However, I do love Story of Your Life. There are things I definitely like about his writing, about his storytelling, about his ideas more than anything. And there's one thing that I realized that why a lot of his stories don't stick for me, and I'll talk about this more in detail with a formal review down the line. But what it is none of his characters have problems when they begin. It doesn't begin with a conflict, internal or external necessarily. There's no deep flaw in these people that is illuminated with the narrative itself. So when we get to the end, it all makes sense. It all kind of comes back to the beginning. 72 letters seemed like a very weak attempt at that, where right when he was trying to protect himself from this guy who was going to kill him, he recalled himself as a child sending his automatons, down the hallway to smash against the walls, and that's kind of what he did. So I guess narratively it was kind of interesting to a degree, but none of these characters have any kind of flaw. None of these, and it's funny because when you read stories, that's really where something begins. So usually the plot is a reflection or an obstacle for the character to overcome based on their flaws, right? It usually reveals something about who they are. None of these stories do that. None of these stories do. The closest one is probably Story of Your Life. However, the only reason that we see loss or trauma early on in that story is because the way he created the narrative. Time is all happening at the same time. We have present, past, future. It doesn't really matter. She's perceiving all of this as a whole. So that's why it worked. Not because he planned it that way in terms of a narrative, because you can see that throughout none of these other narratives. There's nothing like that, period. And that is the major shortcoming for all of these stories for me. Don't get me wrong. Again, there's things I really enjoy about them, but I'd almost prefer Chiang's ideas coupled with a very competent writer. And by writer, I mean someone who knows character dynamics. They know why we begin reading stories, what attaches us to stories, and that is character, trauma, flaw, problems. That is what begins at every single story. That is the heart of every single story. And the plot is only there to either reflect that or be an obstacle for them to explore their flaw and maybe overcome their flaw. I've said my piece. I'll talk about it more in the review. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for reading along with me, hanging out with me. I'm just in this dark room by myself, reading to you in the past and the future. You know what I mean? So next time, we're going to finish out this book finally with the final 2 stories. So I will see you next week. Join the Discord if you're not already. Comment below. Let me know what you're thinking. And I will see you then. Bye.